And before I begin, I would like to wish all my dear faculty members a very happy Engineers Day. So it's a very different way in which we are celebrating, but I hope through our interactions, we are able to bring out, a lot of useful discussions with each other. So before I again begin, so I had planned to discuss with you on the topic of critical information infrastructure protection. But I would like a little feedback from you. Yesterday, we did not touch the topic of encryption, and we went on with a lot of questions. So would you like me to spend about 10 to 15 minutes on encryption, or would you like me to start with my topic? So you can leave your feedback in the chat window, and accordingly I can start the session. So in the chat window, you can tell me whether should I start with my planned session, or do you want me to spend 10 to 15 minutes talking about encryption? So I do not know if you are already aware of the concept of encryption, or is it new to you? All right. So I think I'll start with my topic, and later, if the time permits, we can come back to encryption. Thank you for the feedback. I'll be sharing my screen now. So I plan to talk about critical information in infrastructure protection, which is in both the sessions I'm going to be talking and discussing about this topic. So before I start talking about critical information, I will talk about critical infrastructure protection. So I'm going to first highlight on critical infrastructure protection, and then we will go to critical information infrastructure. So you know that there have been wars in since centuries, and over the decades we have seen all kind of wars between the countries. So there is certain infrastructure which every nation designates as critical, without which the survival of the citizens becomes extremely difficult. So what is that infrastructure, and why is that infrastructure required to be protected? So first, we'll have a very general discussion about critical infrastructure protection. And as I said, then later on, we will, talk about critical information. So let's have a look at this, for example. I think my first, the slide itself has a YouTube video. So what is it that you see in this slide, or maybe this slide? So you can see the electricity, power grid systems. So what is a critical infrastructure? All those facilities, systems, sites, networks, which are necessary for the functioning of society, for the delivery of essential services upon which the life depends. Now, the question is, what is an essential service? So food is an essential service. Electricity is an essential service. Water is an essential service. Transportation is also an essential service. If you Netflix or internet is not working, I mean, that is not counted as an essential service. In general, it is not an essential service. You can live without it. But now that's exactly where the things are changing. So before we entered into the era of, information technology, what services were considered as essential services? And the entire infrastructure which is required to maintain and deliver essential services which you need in your daily life is called critical infrastructure. As an example, the power grids, I'm taking an example of power grids, through which you actually get electricity. Imagine that there is a complete blackout, for 24 hours, 48 hours, what our life is going to be. So all these services are called critical services, and such infrastructure is called critical infrastructure. So the infrastructure, so basically, yesterday we touched upon assets, right? Where we call data information as assets. When somebody asked me the question that water cyber insurance. At that time, I was explaining that how your data, is an asset for you. So those infrastructure assets, which could be either physical or electronic, which are vital for continued delivery and integrity of essential services upon which our entire society relies, and the loss or compromise of which would lead to severe economic or social consequence or loss of life is called critical infrastructure. For example, even in these times of pandemic, when many of the cities or states, they have been under curfew, there have been lockdowns. So the government had primarily given orders that the essential services will continue to run. What were those essential services? You were still getting electricity, you were still getting food delivered at your home, or the departmental stores were kept on, your chemists were there, your water was available to you, your telecom services through which you were communicating, they were kept on. So all these were essential services, and the infrastructure which is required to keep those services on is what is called critical infrastructure. So what are the elements of critical structure? For example, water. Imagine dams, treatment plants, which actually treat the water before you actually get clean water at your homes, pipelines, sewers. These are the elements of water. So these together form the critical infrastructure so that you can get regulated water supply. Similarly, for energy, power stations, transmission lines, these are the elements of energy as a critical service. Food, the distribution networks. Even during curfew, the trucks, they were still allowed. Even though any other traffic was not allowed, but the trucks which were doing distribution and bringing food, fruits, vegetables, they were still allowed to transport food and vegetables. So those were distribution networks, warehouses, and sale points. They were still working because this comes under critical service. Similarly, hospitals, emergency systems, pharmacists like chemists, they were still working. So what are the elements of health? And health falls under critical service. So similarly, transport, road, rail, air, water, airports, seaports, roads, railways, and bridges. So they all form elements of transportation. For communication, the telephones, radio, your cyber world, this forms critical infrastructure. So our main topic that we're going to be discussing today will be IT. IT is a critical infrastructure. But before I, start talking about IT as a critical infrastructure in IT, I want to build on it so that we can take some examples from our daily lives and understand what are critical services. Similarly, finance. Your banks were still working online. You were still able to withdraw money from your ATM. So the essential services of finance has these elements. Then the government work, the national, regional, and local, with essential officers, senior officers, and other necessary staff, the governments were still functioning in these times. Then emergency services like fire, police, ambulance, specialist. So all these were the emergency services. So as you can see from this list, these are the elements of critical infrastructure. Now just imagine a life, where something goes wrong, what would be the consequences of a treatment plant which stops working. For days together, you'll not be able to get clean water, and you'll have to rely by buying mineral water bottles from outside. Similarly, imagine that, if the energy infrastructure like a power grid or something gets damaged and they are not able to repair it for days together, electricity is not available. So these essential services, therefore, constitute critical services, and the entire infrastructure which is required to provide these services to the citizens comes under critical infrastructure. So this is another example that, you'll see basically two roads here. So here we are trying to understand the division of critical infrastructure, national versus local. Just like in the government, we differentiated between national government at a national level, regional level, that is a state level, and a local level, which could be at your city level. So similarly, if you look at the road transportation at a national level versus a local level, now this is a highway. So suppose there has been a heavy snowfall. So what is more important? What really falls under a critical service? The highway which connect various cities or states, or the road which is connecting to your home? So obviously the answer is the highway. So this is a national asset. So if you have to prioritize between cleaning up this versus this from the snow, then obviously the priority will be given to the national asset, because here the exchange, transportation, food delivery, and a lot of other services will get hampered. And this is an example of local life and affairs. So this is a road which is basically linking the transportation. So this is, again, as I just said, transportation is a critical service in this slide, and we are trying to understand the difference between a road, which is of national importance because it's a highway and connect different states, versus a local road. So which one is going to be a bigger asset and which one will get a higher priority? And what could be the hazards to critical infrastructure? There could be natural events, like there could be floods, there could be storms, there could be technological failures, or there could be human errors, or there could be terrorism and sabotage. So in today, we are going to focus more on the third aspect of it, that is terrorism and sabotage, because we are talking about critical IT infrastructure. At the end of the day, this is what we are really going to focus upon. Why? Because for natural events, they have been happening from decades, centuries together, and over a period of time, the governments, nations, states, they have evolved and found out ways to protect themselves from these natural events. So yesterday, when somebody again asked me the question about business continuity, so this is what we have to protect ourselves from. And this is a reason why you require business continuity planning, because there could be any kind of hazards to your critical infrastructure. There can be natural events. So there can be natural events, there can be technological failures, or it could also be attacked by other, rivalry countries, or it could also be internal threat from the internals. So terrorism. If you have a business continuity plan, if you have a plan in place of something like this, which is a disaster will happen, and how do you really detect and how do you really recover from that? So all those aspects come under business continuity, and hence you require business continuity planning. So this is yet another example. So many of you might be hailing from South, and you would have definitely at least heard or maybe have experienced this kind of a natural disaster. What really happens when there is a flood situation? So almost everything in a city comes to a standstill. The railway stations get submerged and you're not able to move to different location to be safe with your relatives, not even temporarily. Your fire stations are submerged, your water treatments, they stop working. You have broadband antennas, there are communication failures. Your electricity and substation, obviously, they in most of the cases, they are turned off, because otherwise there is a very high risk of the current getting the water flowing through the current and getting then the supermarkets, they get submerged, your hospitals, your wastewater treatment stop working, your power stations get affected. So just by one such situation, which is a natural disaster, a flood situation, you can very well see that what kind of services have been hampered. And all of them, which have been listed here, they are critical services. So that is the reason why the nations all governments need to have contingent planning, because they understand all services are critical for the livelihood, for the survival of the citizens. So these services, therefore, have been tagged as critical services, and all that elements that you see here, like railway station, comes under transportation, broadband antenna comes under communication, electricity substation comes under Energy, power stations come under energy, wastewater treatment works, these come under your water as a service, fire stations come under your emergency services, supermarket comes under your food. So in my last slide, I had listed all these services as critical services. Now, in a situation like this, when all these critical services are not available, then what happens to the life of citizens? That is the reason why we have the term critical infrastructure protection. And therefore, the nation needs to have, the governments needs to have a planning that whenever a situation, any situation, such like situation happens, how will they keep their cities, states functioning? How will they be able to provide essential services to the citizens? So this explains what is a critical infrastructure, what are different kind of critical services, and why do we need critical infrastructure protection? So when we are doing the planning, we need to have we need to assess the risk exposure level, whether the risk is low. What is the risk? So obviously, if there are coastal areas, then the risk is very high. And what is then, those places, they'll be called that they have been previously affected, they are near the coast, there have been storms, and generally they are there every year. So there are monsoons which badly affect. So all these such locations, if the risk assessment have been done, then for such areas, the risk assessment will be highest, that is, they are at the highest risk. So we just look at the threat. What is the threat level? And given the higher threat level, what is the level of risk? So generally a risk could be scaled at some level, say between 1 to 100. So based upon different parameters, different locations or different services are for different services, we do a risk assessment and measure the level of risk, whether it's a low risk or a medium risk or a high risk. So this risk assessment is required to be done for all critical services. So for example, now for the critical national infrastructure, the impact, if that stops working, what is going to be the impact? So the impact on life could be very high. So therefore, the impact could be measured at a scale of 5. While for other national infrastructure, which is not, for example, entertainment. So right now also, if you see the Bollywood is not able to shoot their movies. So all these kind of services, entertainment services, cinemas are closed, the gyms are closed. So they all, I mean, the life doesn't stop working. Life gets impaired, but it doesn't stop working. What are the services with which the life stops working? Water, electricity, whatever we have discussed here. So by looking at the impact, we put a criticality scale to these kind of services. We look at impact on life, impact, economic impact, and impact on essential services. And accordingly, on a scale of 1 to 5, we assign them a criticality scale. And critical services or critical infrastructure is that infrastructure which generally falls between 3 to 5. The impact of their not working is between 3 to 5, and therefore the criticality is high. So as of now, I have explained to you what are critical services, what is a critical infrastructure, why do we need critical infrastructure protection, how is risk assessment, I mean, why is it necessary to do a risk or exposure, and I have also just mentioned to you about the measure of these services criticality scale by looking at the kind of impact that they make. So let's give a little break and let's look at a YouTube video which I have for this, and I just hope that the audio is going to be okay. I think I'll come to this a little later. I want to show this, but I want to show this to you when we start with critical information infrastructure. So I'm going to defer this, and probably there's a little sequencing issue. So I'll put this slide. little later. So far, are there any questions for me? Okay. So let's proceed. Now I will continue and give you a formal definition of what is critical infrastructure protection. So critical infrastructure protection is a concept that relates to the preparedness and response to serious incidents that involve the critical infrastructure of a region or a nation. I've told you what is a critical infrastructure protection. I've already discussed with you. So, so this is a concept which relates to our preparedness. How prepared are we to deal with the situation and a response to a serious incident? What could be a serious incident? It could be a natural hazard, a natural disaster, it could be a technological failure, or it could also be a terrorist attack. And again, COVID, an example, that's something we all have experienced. So I'm time and again taking an example of COVID because I feel that all of us can easily relate to it. We never thought we'll have to experience such a pandemic in our lifetime, but yes, we have to. So now, why was these lockdowns done? So at that time, the way pandemic has just shown up, and it has broken the outbreak of this pandemic, none of the nations in the world were actually prepared to deal with it because what is a pandemic which happened across the globe, not in a particular, it was not confined to a particular local area. It was not an epidemic. It was a pandemic. So none of the countries were prepared. So those countries, especially who were not prepared and could see that the other countries, learning from what they are going through because of not being prepared to deal with the situation. So our country was also put on immediate lockdown. So these 2 months and 3 months of lockdown, basically what did it do? It slowed down our life. Only essential services were made to run, and it prepared us to deal with the situation. If this wasn't being slowed down, there would have been no way. Right now, also all hospitals are full, and that is happening after 5 months since the outbreak, and still the situation is there. So just imagine that if that lockdown wouldn't have had happened and we were completely unprepared, the doctors did not have a standard operating procedures of how to deal with it. None of the citizens really knew what kind of precautions have to be taken. So if the life was working the way it was working, you can well imagine the explosion uh, and the rate of fatality that we would have gone through because we were not prepared. And therefore, this lockdown primarily helped us to get prepared to deal with the situation and decide that what kind of response are we going to give. And as we started getting prepared, gradually the services were being opened up, and still the scenario is so bad. So we all have witnessed how critical infrastructure was still running when the curfews and lockdown was there. So are including services like energy, communication, transportation, financial services, food and agriculture. So they were all made to run. So we very well therefore understand the importance as in why the critical infrastructure protection is required. All right, so this is the first video which I will show you. Now, the reason why I am showing this particular video is, let us first understand what this video is all about. So prior to 1995, the only two kind of attacks for which the countries were preparing themselves, natural hazards or human errors. The terrorist attacks could be done to any critical infrastructure were not known. In fact, most of us think that 9/11 was the first such kind of an attack when the Twin Towers of US were attacked by two planes. But in reality, the first such terrorist attack took place in 1995, which was done to Tokyo's subway system. So what really happened during this attack? In the morning rush hours, there were five terrorists, extreme right. I mean, of course, they were terrorists. They were carrying a bag of liquid sarin, which is the most deadly chemical, into Tokyo's substation. And while they had boarded the trains, they pierced the bags and with their tips of their umbrellas. And when they pierced the bags, the gas all started coming out of the bags, and this deadly nerve agent evaporated and spread throughout the station. This attack killed 12 people and injured thousands and thousands more. So now, what was the weapon which was actually used in this case? The weapon was the chemical, a deadly chemical. That was very first time in the history of the world, people realized that the infrastructure, the critical infrastructure, can also be attacked by outsiders, that is the terrorists, other than the natural hazards, disasters, or human errors. So this is a small video which I would like all of you to have a look. Most of this is not known or remembered by anyone, but since I'm talking about critical infrastructure, so I would like all of you to have a look at this.
Terrorists got their hands on
Is it
weapons of
better?
mass destruction. This is one of the most terrifying scenarios that people can imagine, but it isn't an idle fear. 1995. I'm Jim Lindsay, and this is Lesson Learned. Our topic today is the sarin gas attack that the Japanese cult Om Shinriko launched in the Tokyo subway system on March 20th, 1995. Om Shinriko, which translates as Supreme Truth, was a religious cult started in 1984 by Shoko Asahara. He had lost most of his sight as a child, and as a young adult, he studied various strains of Taoism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. These studies eventually convinced him of two things: that he was the first enlightened one to appear on Earth since Buddha, and that the end of the world was near. Asahara targeted his pitch at disillusioned young people. He was a good recruiter. By 1995, Om Shinriko had as many as 40,000 followers. Just as important, Om Shinriko grew rich. By the early 1990s, it had more than $300 million in assets. How did the cult get so wealthy? Partly by running businesses, and partly by requiring members to sign their wealth over to the cult. Om Shinriko's deep pockets enabled it to secretly master the difficult task of making sarin. First created in the 1930s by Nazi scientists looking for better pesticides, sarin is a deadly nerve agent. It kills by disrupting the ability of nerves to communicate with the rest of the body. Sarin is so toxic that inhaling a single drop can be lethal. During the rush hour on the morning of March 20th, 1995, 5 Om Shinriko agents put a liquid form of sarin into packages made to look like lunchboxes and bottled drinks. Perhaps they were driven by the belief that the apocalypse was beginning. Or perhaps they wanted to punish Japan because police were about to raid Om Shinriko's offices. Whatever their motives, the Om Shinriko agents boarded 3 subway lines, punctured their packages with umbrellas, and walked away. The liquid sarin leaked out and turned into gas. The results were horrific. Within minutes, commuters lay on the ground gasping for air, blood pouring from their noses and mouths. Said one survivor of the attacks, hell describes it perfectly. 12 people died that day. 4,000 to 6,000 more were injured. The death toll would have been many times higher had Om Shinriko succeeded in creating a more effective way to disperse the deadly sarin gas. Japanese officials discovered after the attack that Om Shinriko had been experimenting for years with chemical and biological weapons. Indeed, the cult had carried out at least 9 biological attacks. They had all failed because the cult hadn't found an effective way to spread the biological agents. And Om Shinriko had used sarin gas at least once before in a previously unexplained incident that killed people in a Tokyo neighborhood. Asahara and his accomplices were charged with murder. In 2004, they were sentenced to death by hanging. Asahara exhausted his legal appeals in 2006. He now awaits execution. What is the lesson of Om Shinriko's sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway system? Just this: technology makes it possible for groups and individuals to carry out the kinds of attacks that once only governments could undertake. If anything, advances in technology are making it easier for terrorists to contemplate using weapons of mass destruction. The internet makes it far easier to find and share information. Cheaper, more powerful computers and better scientific instruments make it possible for people with basic skills to accomplish things that once required sophisticated laboratories in teams of highly trained, highly skilled scientists. These concerns lie at the heart of the current dispute over news that scientists have discovered a way to transform the H5N1 bird flu virus into a form that could cause a deadly human pandemic. Many scientists worry that this work could eventually be duplicated by less skilled individuals intent on doing harm. Such debates are only going to grow more and more heated in the years to come as technological advances make it possible to do more and more with less and less training. So here is a question to consider. What steps should society take to protect itself as technological developments make it easier for terrorists, messianic figures, or just embittered individuals to inflict great harm? I encourage you to weigh in with your answers on my blog, The Water's Edge. You can find it at cfr.org. I'm Jim Lindsay.
So what was the learning from this particular video? So prior to this video, these kind of attacks, that could injure thousands of people before 1995 could only be undertaken by governments. Nobody ever realized that a group of people, frustrated people or extremists or terrorists could have really done something like that. It was only after this attack there was a realization that a country's critical infrastructure could be attacked, not just by another country, but also by terrorists. And as I asked earlier, what was the weapon of mass destruction? The chemical agent, the gas sarin, was used as the weapon of mass destruction. And what was the critical infrastructure? Why did they choose Tokyo's subway, the subway rail station? That's a transportation, because it is known that it is this transportation, which is like which is a public critical infrastructure used by a lot of people to commute on daily basis, and there will be good number of people who are actually going to be traveling using this subway. So that is why the subway was attacked. The same thing was witnessed, in Mumbai, when our railway stations were also attacked along with the Hotel Taj. So at that time also, while Hotel Taj was our pride of Mumbai, and the railway stations, the local railway stations, large number of our Mumbai citizens, they travel using the local trains. So therefore, those railways were being targeted, which is again falls under critical infrastructure. So there have been after this, there have been several lessons, that we have learned its eyes and realize that the critical infrastructure can be attacked not just by other countries as a part of war, but also is susceptible to terrorist attacks. So as you can now see that our modern life, is so much reliant on wide range of functions. And as discussed, these include services, systems, and the governments view several of these infrastructures like communication, banking, energy, transportation, healthcare that we have discussed. The disruption, destruction, or loss of integrity on any such kind of system can make the entire nation to be unstable. So even during this pandemic, our critical infrastructures are protected. So God forbids, what is the worst that can happen? I'd like to open this question in the chat window. During this pandemic, I'm making a statement that our critical infrastructure is still protected. My question to you is, in the present scenario of COVID-19, what is a situation that you can imagine which can make any one of our critical infrastructure to get disrupted due to COVID-19? I would look forward to some answers on the chat window. I would want someone, anyone, to try answering the question. I'm making a statement that even during our pandemic, our critical infrastructure is protected and essential services are being provided to us. Can you imagine a scenario in which any of a critical service gets disrupted due to COVID, and how? Yes, there is one answer. If death rates suddenly increases globally, economy affected. Okay, I'll reiterate my question. My question is, what is the situation in which a critical service can be disrupted? Can you imagine a situation which leads to disruption of any critical service? All right, I'll give you a clue. Health is one of the most critical service to us. Right now, your health centers, your hospitals are still working. What is the situation due to COVID-19 in which you can imagine your health services to be getting disrupted? And to some extent, that is already happening.
Good morning, ma'am.
Yeah, good morning.
I would like to answer.
Yeah,
Can I?
please. Yeah.
I'm like, right now, we are lacking for the oxygen cylinders,
Yeah.
and the infrastructure of our healthcare sector is also declining. I mean, there are no sufficient beds. There were no sufficient beds and ventilators for patients.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right.
in that scenario, our critical service, which is healthcare, was very much disturbed due to this pandemic.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Simran. So I picked up on what Simran said. Have you imagined the scenario you've been hearing in the news that your doctors have started getting infected? What would happen if this infection rate goes very, very high amongst doctors? What will happen in that case? Your health centers will almost stop functioning. Ultimately, it is the manpower, which is running a particular system. We are not still fully automated. If you do not have the distributed, services, like, for example, in a particular branch of a bank, if, large number of employees get infected, the bank come to a closure. So currently your banks, which provide you financial services, they are distributed, well distributed. And there must be a reason why you have all these services as distributed. So that if there is a complete failure at one branch of the bank, the other branches still function. If many employees get infected, then the other branches are still working. But imagine what happens in case of hospitals. If a large number of doctors start getting infected, you would almost have complete disruption of hospitals, And as such, your health service, which one is your of your critical service, will get completely disrupted. So this is an example of a critical infrastructure getting disrupted. One of the critical infrastructure which is which can get disrupted. So critical infrastructures are often thought as physical assets, like all the examples that we have taken so far, be it health, be it transportation, they have all physical assets. But now let's start looking at them, that all these critical infrastructures are being integrated by the use of information and communication technology, that is ICT. So this makes us, so who are the stakeholders for your critical infrastructure protection? The government agencies, the private sectors, the research agencies like us, the academia, the defense, military intelligence agencies, all IT workers and international organizations. So it is all of us together, these agencies together, which have to actually manage and have stakes in the working of protection of the critical infrastructure. So now I will move to, so till now I have discussed with you what is critical infrastructure. I have made a statement now which says that most of these physical assets that we are talking about have started getting integrated with IT services with the use of communication and cyber. For example, you take an example of banks. Now, banks have become automated and they're providing all their services with the use of IT. They have data centers, they have online services, transactions online. So they are being managed and monitored by the use of IT services. So with this, we start moving towards our main topic, that is critical information infrastructure protection. And before I again talk about it, I will just give you a brief history of internet, because all these services are primarily using internet. So let us discuss very briefly about internet before we again come to critical information infrastructure protection. I'll be very brief on this. So what was the beginning? The internet basically came up in the year 1967, and all of us know that it was a project of ARPANET. So at that time, it was owned by the government. It was designed by the contractors of the government. They were developed by the government contractors, and it was operated by the government. This is a very important slide. Please pay attention to this. In the beginning, when internet came up, when it was a project of ARPA, you can see the internet was owned by government, designed by government, developed by government, and operated by government. That means the complete control of internet was with the government. In 1970s and 80s, internet started expanding, and the communication turns out with the use of very clear application, that was email, which suddenly made it very popular. There were more innovations which started coming up. Your HTTP www service, that is internet pages, and email, they became two most important services. That was the time when military also started using internet, but they required secure systems. So that is the reason why this internet had split into two. So it had to preserve its ARPANET project, and the other project, military split it, and it was called MILNET, which was separated because this had to be a very secure version of internet. And that was the time when government acted as a venture capitalist. For them, it was not possible to, have a complete protocol stack and manage such wide services. So they started investing in the, internet. At that time, scenario changed. This was made an open protocol. When TCP/IP, you know that it is an open source protocol. Now, internet was owned by government. It was still by ARPA. It was designed by everyone. Why? Because you started having open source protocols. It was developed by everyone. Again, the government contractors as well as private sector could develop a protocol. Primarily, it was operated by government contractors. Only BBN was given the contract through which they could look at the operational aspects of it. So this was a change in scenario, as in who owned, who developed, and who operated. So this was the scenario in 1970, 1980. In 1980s and 90s further on, so IETF was created. So that is where more and more different kind of standards required to run internet started coming up. So then they started preparing themselves that now the internet has become so expanded, it has started using commercial dial-up services that, using modems, you can place an order to pizzahut.com and get a delivery for a pizza. So these kind of services started coming up in 1990s. So in comparison to earlier decade, it started gaining much more popularity, that it was no more possible for the government to handle it. So then the ownership was given to NSF, US. It was still designed and developed by everyone, but then the operational part was given to government grant awardees, like those universities who were getting government grants, so that it is still somehow under the control of the government. Now let's see what happened in 1995. In 1995, the NSF backbone was shut down because it expanded so much, and there were internet service providers who started taking up and provided internet services commercially. That was the year where actually the government, the ownership of the government actually ended for internet infrastructure. So please pay attention to this. From 1960s till 1995, the ownership of internet infrastructure was with government, the US government. And after 1995, it actually became far more commercial. So the present internet that you see today is changed all its flavors in 1995. It is now owned by everyone. You have internet service providers, you have private networks, you have public networks. It is designed by everyone. You have open design consortiums. It is developed by everyone and it is operated by everyone. We are operating it, government organizations are operating it, private sectors are operating it. So internet now is a network of network, and primarily it has become so. If the question is asked that is internet regulated? No, internet is not regulated. There is no one single entity today which is controlling or regulating the internet. So it's since 2006, onwards, then there were major changes. So as far as law is concerned, so there are some basic rules which govern what is legal and what is illegal, but every country has its own law for internet. Industry regulations, you have some standards, like you have ISO 27000 for information security management, but that's not a mandatory standard. So industries, so there is nothing which is mandatory except for critical services. Like for health, we have industry regulations such as HIPAA. For credit cards and plastic cards-based currencies, it is PCI, which is the standard. So you have such kind of regulations, but it is only sector-wise regulations. And there are some initiatives which have been taken by various government agencies to cooperate with each other and try that internet can be basically secure. So what's the point? Why did I discuss with you about internet? So what I want to basically want you to understand, therefore, and take away from this is, internet is a complex web of interactions. There are many different government and private actors which have their own interests and specialities. There is no single leader. One good thing is it is highly distributed. One bad thing is that because there is no single regulatory authority, so therefore anyone can do anything and use or misuse internet in any ways. Okay, so now this video I'm not showing right now. I will go back to one video which is from a Hindi movie which I was trying to do here, which is going to build up on what I want to talk for rest of my session.
मदद करता है। ये सीन जरूर फिल्मी है, लेकिन साइबर हैकर्स का खौफ असली है। ये वो खतरा है जिसे नजरअंदाज करने की गलती नहीं की जा सकती। ये चुनौती है जिसका सामना करना ही होगा। क्योंकि अगर मेट्रो का सर्वर हैक हुआ तो नतीजा भयानक तबाह। अगर एयरपोर्ट का सर्वर हैक हुआ तो अंजाम होगा विमानों की टक्कर। और अगर पावर प्लांट हैक हुआ तो मतलब होगा पावर सप्लाई ठप। और न्यूक्लियर प्लांट हैकर्स की चपेट में आ गए तो अंजाम ऊपर वाला ही जान पाएगा। पहली बार जो मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन टेक्नोलॉजी है वो नेशनल क्रिटिकल इंफॉर्मेशन इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर प्रोटेक्शन सेंटर के साथ मिलकर एक बड़ी कॉन्फ्रेंस करने जा रही है, जिसमें देश और दुनिया के 100 से ज्यादा देशों के जो साइबर एक्सपर्ट हैं, जो हैकर हैं, वो उसमें भाग लेंगे। और खासतौर से एक मॉडल हम दिखा रहे हैं। इस तरह के मॉडल पर जो हैकर हैं वो टेस्ट करेंगे कि कैसे किसी सिस्टम को फेल किया जा सकता है और उससे कैसे उसका बचाव किया जा सकता है। तो ये एक तैयारी है साइबर सिक्योरिटी के मोर्चे पर सरकार की तरफ से, क्योंकि एक बड़ा क्षेत्र है आज के दौर में। आने वाले दिनों में जो मेट्रो है, हम बात करते हैं कि वो ड्राइवर की लेस होगी, यानी कि बिना ड्राइवर के मेट्रो चलेगी। इसी तरह से जो एयरपोर्ट का इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर है वो लगातार बढ़ता जा रहा है। उसके साथ ही जो स्मार्ट सिटी है, हर चीज टेक्नोलॉजी से, साइबर स्पेस से वो चल रही है। ऐसे में मुश्किलें भी काफी बड़ी हैं। तो तैयारी शुरू हो गई है साइबर हैकर्स की तमाम साजिशों को नाकाम करने की। 20 नवंबर से दिल्ली में ग्लोबल कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑन साइबर स्पेस 2017 यानी हैकाथन का आयोजन होगा। उद्घाटन पीएम नरेंद्र मोदी करेंगे। 120 देशों के साइबर एक्सपर्ट्स की हिस्सेदारी होगी। ये कॉन्फ्रेंस थोड़ा अलग किस्म का है। मेट्रो, एयरपोर्ट, पावर प्लांट के सर्वर की खामियां ढूंढने की कोशिश की जाएगी। साइबर एक्सपर्ट्स को सर्वर हैक करने की चुनौती दी जाएगी। सबसे दमदार हैकर को प्रधानमंत्री सम्मानित करेंगे। आप कह सकते हैं कि ये नाक उल्टे पकड़ने जैसी कसरत है, लेकिन इसका मकसद यही है कि हम अपने सिस्टम की खामियां और कमजोरियों को पहचान पाए, उन्हें समय रहते दूर कर पाए, ताकि जब वाकई हमला हो तो हम सुरक्षित रह सकें। देखिए, सभी उपकरण जितने भी हैं ये इंफॉर्मेशन टेक्नोलॉजी के ऊपर आधारित हैं और इनमें एक लिमिट तक ये उम्मीद हो सकती है कि कोई उसको हैक कर दे, लेकिन इसको किस तरह से हमें बचाना है, इसकी ही एक ये हमारा परीक्षा है, जिसमें बहुत से हैकर्स आएंगे और वो अपना जो काबिलियत है दिखाएंगे। और इसके साथ साथ हमें ये देखना है कि क्या त्रुटियां जो हमें हमारे क्षेत्र में इस आईटी सेक्टर में हैं, क्या हम उनको प्लग कर सकते हैं, क्या उन त्रुटियों को हम सोल्यूशन दे सकते हैं। और इसी का नाम हमारे यहाँ एक कंपटीशन भारत सरकार की तरफ से कराया जा रहा है। हैकिंग एक ऐसा साइबर खतरा है जिस पर आंखें नहीं मूंदी जा सकती। सरकारी एजेंसियां हैकर्स से बचने के लिए क्विक हील जैसी निजी कंपनियों से मदद ले रही। जापान, इजिप्ट, इजराइल और रूस से भी बात की जा रही। साइबर थ्रेट्स की जानकारी के लिए आईटी समेत कुछ अन्य संस्थानों की भी मदद ली जा रही है, यानी पूरी तरह चाक चौबंद होने की तैयारी है। जो साइबर सिक्योरिटी की चुनौतियां हैं, जो हैकिंग की चुनौतियां हैं, उसके सिस्टम को हैक करने की, वो भी लगातार बढ़ रही है। और ऐसे में पहली बार मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन टेक्नोलॉजी और नेशनल क्रिटिकल इंफॉर्मेशन इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर सेंटर देश और दुनिया के तमाम साइबर एक्सपर्ट और हैकर जो है उनको इस सिस्टम के साथ एक कंपटीशन यहाँ पर किया जा रहा है, जिसकी मदद से ये कोशिश की जाएगी किस तरह से सिस्टम को हैक किया जाए और उसको एक फुल प्रूफ सिस्टम तब्दील किया जाए। कैमरामैन संजय चौधरी के साथ में जीतने की दिल्ली आज।
So why did I show this to you? So now I wanted you to appreciate that I have been talking to you about essential services like food, electricity, transportation, health, and so on. Now we are also talking about smart cities. That means all these essential services have been automated. Have you thought about, as the example which has been taken, the metros? So metros also primarily is nothing but it is completely now driven with electricity. Then it has been fully automated. It is controlled by sensors. There are so many sensors which are actually integrated as a part of the metro and the metro stations as well. Similarly, these driverless cars have already started being used. Like Tesla is one example. So it is already there being in use from last 4 years in US, and it is also now going to other countries. Then there are so many other autonomous, services which are being provided. And then just imagine that during the pandemic, while we were not able to move out, we were doing almost placing all our orders to the groceries, for the groceries and for the vegetables and fruits and other personal care items primarily online. So all our banking was completely online. The electricity bills, the water bills, and our telecom bills were being online. And the very reason we were still comfortable at our home was because we had internet. You still had the telecom network which was operational. You still had internet which was actually operational. So you could still use Netflix, you could still hear all the news, you had everything latest, you still had this WhatsApp and Facebook and your social media which was running. So all those services were still running because of internet. Can you again imagine a day without internet, with no news, with no television, with no internet on your mobile phone, with no communication? How isolated you would be. So that is still about communication. But then can you imagine if the telecom sector stops working? How much dependence we have on internet, how much dependence do these services, how IT has integrated with food, hospitals, energy, transportation, and everything. I mean, can you imagine yourself now going to the railway station and getting a train ticket book? No, you all book it on IRCTC. If we had to travel online, all our bookings made online. Imagine that you have to go to a travel physical and get the bookings done. So look at the penetration of IT services with the essential services. That is what makes us, come to the point that how information and data has become another critical service. Internet service, network service, how this communication has become one of the critical service. So, in the next session, which I start here, I am going to primarily focus on why this data is so important. What is this role of data? How the countries have started, the information warfare has become the fifth dimension of fighting wars between various countries. So, for that, let's look at this. Yeah. So information warfare is, there is a term called information warfare, which is about control of information. So now the countries are fighting over information. So in the primitive world, maybe we also consider different warfare. Countries are pretty well prepared. Like the wars are fought in air, and therefore you have air force. The wars are fought in sea, therefore you have navy. The wars are fought on land, therefore you have army. So these are three tri-services, but now the wars are also being fought over information, and that is called information warfare. And that is where the nations are preparing themselves, and that is why there are countries which are making huge investment about controlling the information. The fourth dimension which I missed, I mean, land, you already know, the wars are fought over land, and you can also all of you are able, I'm sure you're witnessing the India China standoff, and that is also over a territory. Then air is, as I said, air force. Sea, as I said, navy. The fourth is, of course, the nuclear weapons. So that also we are very well aware of. And the fifth is information warfare. And the other one which we have again witnessed is bio warfare. Pandemic, COVID as a virus, known as a biological weapon. We have also seen, we are also witnessing that. But here today, my focus is going to be that how information warfare has become so important. It is all about data and information. Why countries are trying to have a control over information? How does it affect a critical infrastructure? How can it completely disrupt the working of nations and disruption of services to the citizens of any country? So I read one of my colleague who's also my friend, he derived this. I read on one of his article, data owners are the keepers and the masters. Jiski lathi uski bhans. So now this lathi and this bhans, so big data is what is known to be this. So the data owners, they are becoming more and more powerful. So any country who has the ownership of the data, who has maximum data, is becoming the most powerful country. That is about information warfare. So why this information warfare? What is it? Basically, it is defined as a planned attack by nations or their agents against information and computer systems, computer programs, and data, which results in enemy loss. And why is it far more complicated? Yesterday, again, somebody asked me a question that why is it so intricate to come up with a cyber law? So the attributes of an information warfare, one, it is borderless. So in case of India and China, a border exists, a physical border exists. And anybody who crosses that border, I mean, you call it as an infringement. But in case of internet, there are no borders. So right now, I am using Cisco. Where is the Cisco server? Is it currently hosted in US or is it hosted in Singapore? Where is my data going? Where is my voice going? It is all borderless. Then there is anonymity. So yesterday I spoke about it. You are able to use proxy. Then the only way by which you can actually identify an individual is with the use of an IP address. But then which can very easily be anonymized. But in case of physical wars, there is an identity attached to every attacker. Then non-traceability. This also I talked to yesterday. How can you trace back to somebody who's doing an attack? In case of your information network, it is again only your IP address. So how do you trace back who is actually the hacker? And most often it is only through patterns, that one tries to trace it, because every big hacker group has a particular pattern to show. Otherwise, it is not even possible to trace back. At most, you can trace back that the attack came from actually Russia, but you never know it was actually Chinese hackers which routed the attacks through Russia, and therefore you are attributing the attack to Russia, but actually they were Chinese hackers. So it is completely non-traceable. Then this is low cost. I'll come to this in my next few slides. Plus there is continuity. You see, in case of a war, a physical war, there is always a date and a time. If an attack is done, say suppose it was Balakot strike, or it was the terrorist attacked us, or there is an Indo-China standoff where there is a lot of tension, there is a date when it started and there is a time. And at some time, it would also stop. But in case of cyber crimes and in case of these attacks, they are continuous. They happen day or night, they stop for months, they again come up. There is no particular time period when these attacks are done. So the life cycle, and then the life cycle of the data, the data is created, it is stored, it is used, it is shared, it is again archived, might be destroyed or it might not be destroyed. And so therefore the life cycle of the data is also really, really big. So I mentioned that the cost of information warfare is very low in comparison to others. Why? If you take an example of a stealth bomber, cost is about 1.5 to 2 billion. What does a stealth fighter cost? This is a bomb, this is a fighter. 80 to 120 million dollar. What does a cruise missile cost? 1 to 2 million. So here we are all talking in millions. What does a cyber weapon cost? What is a cyber weapon? A malware. Even if you do not know how to develop a malware, you can easily buy it from internet. And the cost is just between $300 to $50,000. And here you are all talking about the cost in millions. And here through a cyber weapon, you can destroy a complete IT system of a nation by affecting them. You can still attack the critical infrastructure, cyber infrastructure of another nation by these weapons. And you can see the cost attached to these weapons is so low. Then the other thing is weapons. So if we talk about a nuclear weapon, we know where that facility is. Every country tries to hide their facility from nuclear weapons, but the nuclear weapon facility exists physically. There is a location where the nuclear weapons are kept, they are developed, or they are tested. But in case of cyber weapons, can you really find out from the entire nation where, which home, which house, which office, which computer is he using the malware from? So in comparison to a nuclear weapon facility and to the location of cyber weapon facility, it's impossible to compare them. They physically exist here, and here they're all in a virtual world. Somebody might have been using, as I said, a computer in Russia while sitting in India and attacking China. So where is physically the cyber weapon? Where is actually the malware? So the physical location is completely indeterminate. So it is these kind of differences, which are there between a physical crime and a cyber crime, which makes these modern cyber weapons, far more complex, intricate, and difficult. So what are the threats? For example, compromising information. So in case of US Air Force, they have classified the following threats as the warfare threats: the malicious code, intruding into our system, psychological ops. What are psychological operations? So whenever there is any incident which happens, this is all together basically a very different topic. And if you have some interest, then maybe, I can talk more about it. But just to give you an example, misinformation is one of the biggest psychological operation. For example, at the time when our Air Force officer Abhimanyu was, his aircraft had fallen, and he was found in the boundaries on the other side of the border. Then there were completely two opposite kind of information which was flowing. So Indian Army government was mostly quiet, because it is supposed to be an intelligent information and they are not supposed to share it with the public. On the other hand, there was a lot of news which was fake news, which was being spread, that Abhimanyu was actually dancing with the Pakistani corps and with their army. All that was a deliberate psychological operation which was being conducted to bring down the morale of the Indian army as well as Indian public. Then there was a lot of misinformation to show that actually Abhimanyu is, opened up the secrets of India. So, Pakistan as another nation state was deliberately doing this, primarily to bring down the morale of the country. So, lot of times, if you see how media plays a role, what kind of role does social media play, there will be a news on the India side regarding a particular episode or an incident, and you go to another country's site, as an example, say Pakistan Tribune. You go to their website and you'll hear a completely opposite verdict of that particular episode. And then there are these news, the media, especially the social media, which are being funded to spread and make sure that the spread of a particular kind of information is far more. And there is a purpose of doing that. So this is also a threat. Misinformation, spread of misinformation comes under psychological operations. And this is deliberately done. There are internal wars. So the informations are spread so that, Indian citizens or any nation's citizens, they split. How would they split? If there is misinformation about something. And a lot of mistrust starts building up amongst the people. And this is how different political parties are also basically misusing it. So this is what is a psychological operation which is conducted using social media these days, and the penetration has become far more simpler. 50%, at least 50% of the news which is spreading on social media currently is a misinformation and is a part of psychological operations. Then intelligence collection, technology transfer, software bugs. So this is all compromise of information. Then there is deception, corruption of data, which is done using malicious codes, system intrusions, by deception amongst the military, or spoofing attacks, imitating attacks, So that's deception. Then there is denial, making a service unavailable. So again, that is done using malicious codes or by intruding into systems, physical attacks, jamming frequencies so that sometimes the communication cannot happen. And then there's destruction of information. So that is also done using malicious codes or cyber bombs or directed, sometimes even energy weapons, biological and chemical warfares, which are being fought. The sarin gas attack was an example of chemical warfare. It has yet not been concluded, and there is no concrete, evidence. But COVID-19 might also be actually an example of biological warfare causing into such kind of mass destruction. So all these are basically information warfare threats, which the U.S. Air Force currently have categorized into. I think I'd like to pause here, and we're almost at the end of this particular session, and we'll start with second session. And before I actually drop out, if there are some quick questions, then I would like to take the questions. Any observations, comments, quick questions? Please drop them on the chat window.
Participants may use the chat box, please, in case if you want to raise any queries.
Uday, what was your question? Was that you were wanting to have a list of network security tools? Okay. Okay, I'll bring them up, I think, in the next session. More cybercrime started happening from 1995 or before that? Yes, as and when the internet started becoming more and more popular, the cybercrimes also started increasing. So 1995 attack is significant because the countries realized that the threat is just not another nation. It could also come from terrorists. Prior to that, it was not known that even terrorist organizations can attack a critical infrastructure of a country. So right now, also you see that even if they are, whether they are cyber attacks or any other kind of attacks, so the countries need to not only protect themselves from other nations, but they also need to protect themselves from the terrorist organizations. And even for the purpose of information warfare, there are a lot of attacks which are also being done by terrorists. So that is the significance of 1995 attack. How cybersecurity experts differ from ethical hackers? Well, in terms of skill set, the skill set is the same. It's just the purpose for which the skill set is being used. So ethical hackers primarily come, and why the word used ethic is because they make it public, and the purpose for which they are doing hacking is to help an organization know its vulnerabilities. So they are there to point out vulnerabilities by hacking them and showing them, look, these are the vulnerabilities, these are the weaknesses of your system. And the cybersecurity experts, primarily they have an expertise to plan and have a complete plan as to how to manage the information systems, how to make them secure using various technological advancements. So that is primarily the difference between cybersecurity experts and ethical hackers. We are using multiple applications like Google Pay for bank transactions and sharing bank details, also using card details to shop online. Can this? Yes. Amit, I have my next session is primarily going to focus on these kind of discussions. I'm going to talk about the personal data, how much of our personal data is actually getting collected by different applications, different countries. So this question of yours will get answered then. All the data packets flowing into the country's network are scrutinized? No, not really. Again, you can ask this question in the next session, and I think maybe with my slides, this will actually get answered. So I see that many that you are asking, I already have. I'm going to be talking about them in my next session. In my next session, I'm going to talk about how different countries are doing surveillance on the cyberspace, how the data is actually getting collected and we are not even aware about it. And that will lay a lot of more importance to why these critical information infrastructure needs to be protected and what our country is doing about it. So this is it for all, I think. And we'll see you. The next session starts at 2:30 p.m.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your non-stop inputs to the participants. Actually, I don't have any background of computer science, but still I could relate it with the examples that you were citing. So really interesting. Thank you so much for your ocean of knowledge. Once again, thanks for the resource person for her non-stop flow of information. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to the host for making sure that it was all seamless and comfortable. And thank you to all the participants for your patient hearing.